All right, I think we're good. We're going to start. I know that people are probably going to trickle in, but I'm so happy to be with you here today. This is our first official Rosie Presents, and we are launching it's online and also in person. It's a way to bring events to you from Rosie the Riveter Trust and from our wonderful treasurer of a park. And that's actually why the trust exists. It's to support the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park located in Richmond, California, telling the story, the national story of the Homefront. So this today is our first Rosie Presents program. So pleased to have Lincoln Cushing with us here today. I think we're in for a real treat. And I do want to say there's one other event coming up this year, and that is an opportunity to meet Rosie May Cryer in person on Wednesday, December 1st. And you can go to our website. And we are asking for, we do have a ticket price, and that's just to offset our expenses to rent the location, which is going to be the Crane Way right next to the visitor center. So if you don't know about May Cryer, she is a celebrity in her own right. She was the one that made over 5,000 masks during COVID to rally people together that we can do it. She has helped on the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor to get that in place, and also National Rosie the Riveter Day. So it's quite an honor to have her, and you can read more about it on our website. Today, I am so pleased to actually hand the mic over to my colleague and fellow board member, Michelle Fedeli. And Michelle, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where everyone is. But I just wanted to let you all know that Michelle has been on the board since 2019, but she has been involved with Rosie the Riveter Trust years prior. And she serves as our secretary and also the chair of our development committee. She really is passionate about history, American history, and also the Homefront, because she has Rosies in her family. Michelle, thank you so much for being here and actually just taking the mic today and helping us introduce our first Rosie Presents. And I'll hand over the mic to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Good morning if you're in Hawaii with my daughter who's at university there. We're so glad to have you all with us and really excited to start this speaker and event series, Rosie Presents, but especially honored to have Lincoln Cushing start us off today. We're all in for a very informative and entertaining hour. Really looking forward to this. Lincoln, if you are not familiar with him, is a former employee of Kaiser Permanente, but he's a librarian, an author and lecturer, and just a wealth of knowledge all around. So we're so lucky. He was an archivist and historian for Kaiser. And so he definitely has the inside information and lots of history to share. So with that, Lincoln, welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is great. I backed into Homefront history because of the job at Kaiser Permanente. When I took the job, I was doing that for 10 years. It's mostly focused on health plan and hospitals and all that, but the fact is that the Kaiser Permanente Health Plan really got off the ground in the shipyards. And that was an entree for me to start working with the emerging national park there. And that became, for me, one of the best parts of the job. And so I'm thrilled to be able to work with you, with the trust on doing this, because the trust supports the park and the park supports this whole slice of history. And so I've been given the opportunity here to give a quick introduction to what the Homefront really meant. And it's sort of like taking a sip of water from a fire hose. So this is a slam dunk through the hoops, quick history lesson. And there's plenty of loose ends to go, but this should give you a good start. So I'm going to go to my presentation and we'll take it from there. There'll be questions at the end. Thank you.
And while Lincoln's getting started, just wanted to say, please write your questions in the chat as we go along, and then I'll give you a chance again at the end.
Okay, so this is about the legacy of the home front. You know, a lot of what I did as a Kaiser permanent communicator is tie history to the present. And I think it's really important to engage people in history. A lot of people can zone out. It's like, oh, history's boring. And I don't find it that way. And so part of the reason I realize that is because history continually reverberates and resounds. So let's jump into this. Okay, why am I having trouble? So here's the shipyards. If you notice, right in the middle here is the Ford Motor Company. The Ford assembly plant was there on this giant section of land, which of course originally was Ohlone land, then became Spanish land, and then Mexican land, and then Anglo land. This is a long history of this section of the San Francisco Bay, but the Ford Motor Company set up there to build trucks in the 30s. And then just before World War II, Henry Kaiser, the famous industrialist, said, well, I realize I want to help with the war effort, what's going on in Europe. And he got a contract to build ships for the British. So this was in 1940-41. He was finishing up Grand Coulee Dam. And so if you look at this map, you start to see, you know, shipyard number 1. Well, that was where he was building ships for the British. And then eventually, as the war went along, they kept expanding and expanding. And the visitor center for the park is right next to the Ford Motor Company plant there. It's where they stored the combustibles to run the generators, to run the electricity, to run the plant. So this gives you a little bit of a clue. Henry Kaiser had built 2 shipyards. He built 3 up in the Northwest in the Portland area, and 4 eventually in the Richmond area. Plus he ended up building a steel mill in Fontana in Southern California because there wasn't enough steel to run all these ships. And so it was the first West Coast steel mill. Now, Henry J. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder, but he was really good at working with federal agencies, and he was really good at large scale industrial projects. And so he partnered with a shipbuilder back east to get this contract to build ships for the British. And you look at these first ships that were launched. Well, this was before Pearl Harbor. This was before the US was involved. So we're starting to build ships for the British. And then what comes along is Pearl Harbor. So what happened after Pearl Harbor? This was a really, really big deal because we got involved in the war and everything turned upside down. One of the biggest things that changed was the workforce. So here's Henry Kaiser, bald guy in the background there, surrounded by what was the typical workforce in the shipyards in 1940 and in the beginning of 1942. Older white guys. Many of them had been doing this kind of work for multiple generations. That was the way that most American industries went, was, you know, guys did what their fathers did. There wasn't a lot of mobility, and these were pretty decent jobs in the shipyards. But what started to happen was, well, all of a sudden, the healthy white guys start going off to fight the war. And that leaves a huge vacuum for the labor force. And this is really a big deal because all of a sudden, you know, Henry Kaiser's job, which was building ships, well, to build ships, you need people and you need equipment. Well, the equipment was hard enough because the military was getting priority for everything, but the people was another priority. And the healthy white guys were all going off to fight the war. So who's left? I mean, some of these people stuck around, some of the more senior workers were needed to continue to build the ships, but you needed a whole new labor force, not only because the original people were leaving, but because the scaling up of this was huge. So you start to hire people. Now, at first, Henry Kaiser said, I'm just going to start hiring people to work in the shipyards. And he would hire anybody because the workforce was wide open. So if you look at this ad on the left, shipyard helpers wanted at the shipyards, you didn't even need to be a US citizen to work in the shipyards. They were really desperate to get people to come in. This was a labor force crisis. And Henry Kaiser was a very open-minded, ethical guy for an American industrialist. And he said, I'll take anybody. I really have no investment in a segregated workforce. And he started to hire Black people. And he was doing this through the United States Employment Service. This is through a federal program to get people to work in war industries. And instantly he starts to run into problems with the unions, because the unions, many of the unions, especially the Boilermakers, which was the most important union representing the shipyard workers, well, they saw this as a threat to their control over the workforce. So there was a big tussle over who, in fact, could hire workers to work in the shipyards. And this was particularly difficult in the Northwest shipyards in the Portland area. And so Henry Kaiser locked horns with the Boilermakers Union agent up there about, can you or can you not hire workers directly? And there was a big fight. This went on for a bit, but ended up being finally resolved, where Henry Kaiser had to back off from direct hiring because the union said, look, these are closed shops. We control all the hiring. So by federal law, this was out of Henry Kaiser's hands. So but it didn't mean that the fight was over. And because it was such a need for workers, there were other forces at work that said, okay, we want to make it possible for people to come into working in the shipyards. And this report from 1943 starts to show the impact of this giant vacuum of the labor force. People were going to where the good jobs were. These were good union jobs during the war. This is at the tail end of the Depression. People were thrilled to be able to get jobs, not only because we were helping the war effort, but because they were good paying jobs. And for many of these people, this was an entry into a whole industry that they didn't even have access to before. So this funky hand-drawn map shows you a lot of people came from the South, a lot of people came from the Midwest. This was a huge turnout to the West Coast, especially. Also, people were going to the Pacific Northwest. So the shipyards in the Northwest, the Kaiser shipyards in the Northwest, really had a different challenge there, because in Richmond, at least, there's been a history of African Americans in Richmond because of the railroad industry and rail car porters. In the Northwest, there wasn't much of a history of Black people coming to work there, and this was a constant challenge. This was really a difficult thing. There was segregated housing. They built the second largest city in Oregon to accommodate African American workers, Vanport. So this was a huge struggle of getting Black workers to work in the Portland area shipyards. This is a train that was brought over, and I pointed out the few African Americans that I could identify in the picture, but this was before the unions started to say, well, we control all the hiring. So what the unions did, the Boilermakers did, was they said, we'll set up a second tier system. They called them auxiliaries, to allow African American workers to work in the shipyards, but they paid dues. They had second class status. This was a constant battle throughout the war, didn't get resolved until the end of the war. So Black workers could work in the shipyards, but they didn't have federal protection to do so. And the unions set them, especially the Boilermakers, had them in a second class status, which was a constant source of friction throughout the war. Women, on the other hand, did have federal protection. And so equal pay for equal work. We had a Frances Perkins, a woman Secretary of Labor. Imagine that. So she said, this is really an important opportunity for women to go into the workforce. And you can see by this chart, the workforce steadily grew to about a third of the workforce in the shipyards was women. Now, these weren't all great, best jobs. A lot of these were entry-level jobs. A lot of these women were being trained to do this. Here's a couple of women in their welding leathers in their training program. So a lot of the women and African Americans were in the entry-level jobs. They were burners, not welders. What a burner would do would be to burn off what the welder did and clean it up. There were grinders, there were sweepers. They were literally sort of the bottom end of the industrial food chain, but at least they were decent paying union jobs. And they were pretty much protected because during the war, we needed all the workers we could get. But they were entry-level jobs, and there were a lot of African Americans that came in and said this was an opportunity for me to do something that I never had a chance to do. But when you see, the women welders, there were very few African American welders. Most of them were doing the slightly lower status jobs within the industry, but they were present, and they were part of our messaging, which I'll get to later. You see here, there were stories in the shipyard newspapers about African Americans in the shipyards, talking about having come here, from picking cotton in a Louisiana plantation to working here. The pay's better, and the working here is pleasant. He was in the Portland area. Here, this woman on the right, a lovely photograph of this African American woman working in the Richmond shipyards. Part of our messaging was, we are democratic and inclusive. And even though the devil was in the details, and you pick at this stuff about women in the workforce, African Americans in the workforce, it wasn't perfect, but it was really a groundswell of opportunities for people to get into a union doing jobs in the trades that they never had before. Another aspect of the labor force was not just the people in the shipyards that built the ships, but the people that ran the ships. And so Henry Kaiser was really very good about working with labor. He understood that labor was these were the people that he had to work with. And if you do it right and you get them on your side, you can be far more productive. When he had been at Grand Coulee Dam and realized that a heavily unionized workforce was much more productive than one that wasn't. So he became a real friend of labor and a friend of diversity. And he understood that a diverse workforce can be a very productive workforce. So the people that ran the ships, most of the ships that were produced in the Kaiser shipyards were merchant vessels. He did do some Navy vessels. He had a great effort at building small aircraft carriers. That's a whole other story. But most of the ships that were built were merchant marine vessels that were crewed by merchant mariners. Well, merchant marine had a whole separate track. They weren't Navy people. And the service organization for the merchant mariners was the United Seamen's Service. Well, Henry Kaiser was the head. He founded the United Seamen's Service. And he said, this is not going to be a segregated place. So you look at this picture here, African-American guy playing the piano at a USS Center in San Francisco. Well, the military was segregated. The USOs were segregated. Service organizations for the military were segregated. So the impact of Henry Kaiser's support for the seamen's organizations was really supported by the Black press. They realized that this was a real breakthrough in saying, look, if Henry Kaiser can do this, our own Navy and military should be able to do this. So the impact of the labor force, including the people that ran the ships and operated the ships, was really an important step in understanding the impact of the labor and how everything turned upside down during the home front. So let's look at another aspect of the home front, which was healthcare. Before World War II, most people never had healthcare. It was like healthcare was something you save your money. If you could afford it, you see a doctor. But Henry Kaiser had really developed a plan at Grand Coulee Dam, again, because the union said, we really want you to take care of not just us, but our families. And so for the first time, Henry Kaiser said, okay, we'll set up a hospital here, we'll bring up physicians, and for the families, for 50 cents a week, you can join the plan. And for the first time, they were able to get a health plan. This was like at the end of the Depression, this was an unknown concept. But Henry Kaiser just was a practical industrialist, and he realized if somebody who's, your spouse is sick, you're less likely to show up on the job. And if you're not showing up on the job, you're not doing the job. You're not building the dam, you're not building ships. So the more that you stretch out what the health plan was and who's included, the more likely it is that your workforce is going to be healthy and productive. And so he applied this to the shipyard workers during World War II, and this was a huge deal. First it was just for the workers. Then it was expanded to the families. And this made it really possible for people to get healthcare for the first time, and it was good healthcare. So here you see the brochure for the health plan. Here you see that the first aid stations. There are first aid stations at all of the shipyards. In Richmond, there was the Richmond Field Hospital, which is still there. It's still to be understood as a historic site, but the facility is still there. Plus, the first Kaiser Hospital in Oakland was built to accommodate the shipyard workers. It was opened in 1942, and that was in Oakland, and that was a real hospital with real physicians. This was not cheap Band-Aid working class healthcare. This was top quality healthcare. And so some examples of what I mean by top quality healthcare, because of the care that was provided to the workers for pneumonia in the shipyards, one of the physicians in the Kaiser health plan got the first civilian doses of penicillin, which was instrumental in curing pneumonia. But the military got all the priority for the medical stuff. But because of the quality of the care in the shipyards, the first civilian doses of penicillin went to the Richmond shipyards, and it was literally a life-saving drug. Maury Collin was a fantastic physician, and his work was groundbreaking in curing people who needed the help to get back on the job. We had a gynecologist on staff in the shipyards. Because we had so many women, you had to have somebody who dealt with the healthcare needs of women. How do you make sure that they get trained right? How do you make sure that they get the right vitamins? How do you make sure that there's a program to deal with, VD for women in the shipyards? This never existed in industrial care. So the fact that we had such a huge influx of women in the shipyards affected the very nature of the healthcare program that you had in industrial care in America. This never happened. So we had Hannah Peters, a gynecologist on staff, dealing with the healthcare needs of the women in the shipyards. This had never happened before. The fact that this was such a working class friendly healthcare plan translated when the healthcare plan opened in 45, right after the war, right before the war was open even. It was seen as a very labor-friendly plan. Harry Bridges signed up the entire West Coast of longshore workers. Well, we didn't even have facilities all over the West Coast. We had to build a hospital in Southern California. We had to contract for care in the Seattle area. But it shows how we were seen as very labor-friendly. And here we are, the longshore newspaper, the Dispatcher, shows us in a very positive light, giving a vaccination to a longshore worker. I mean, we were really seen as a labor-friendly plan, and we were in the right place at the right time when employer-sponsored healthcare emerged in the late 40s and early 50s. And so this, of course, set us up as being branded as socialized medicine. The American Medical Association tried to shut down the Kaiser Health Plan, but we were doing the right thing at the right time for the right people. And it emerged out of the healthcare plan that grew in the shipyards, and that's much to be proud of. Another aspect is labor journalism. You think about the shipyard newspapers, okay? there was a weekly shipyard newspaper that was going on in both of the shipyards in the Northwest and in Richmond. And at first, this was this pretty standard fare. This was oriented towards the standard industrial workforce, the healthy white guys. But that had to change. Once the workforce changed, the newspapers had to change. So you start to have, you look at some of the stuff in the early shipyard newspapers, and it's cringeworthy. You literally have a minstrel show advertised. You literally have an ad about making fun of a gay man coming to work in the shipyards. I mean, this is stuff that sort of the guys would laugh at in 1941. By late 1942, this humor, this culture didn't work anymore. You started to have people said, wait a second, this doesn't look like me. So you start to have a real shift in what the journalism was, who wrote the stuff, what the stories were. So this cartoon sort of shows the change in the workforce. This was in the Richmond newspaper. This woman coming in getting hooted at in 42. Well, by 43, that kind of stuff wasn't really the case. This was a groundswell in the labor force, and it really affected the stories that were written about it. This was all about a different kind of journalism. So I'm going to talk about one woman, Emmylou Packard. I knew her as a red diaper baby. She, learned to study art with Diego Rivera, and so she understood and had a very big sensibility about working class art, Latin American support. And so she worked on the Kaiser Richmond shipyard for about 1.5 years and did a whole bunch of illustrations. And she did stuff from a women's point of view for a women's audience. This is a great photograph of her, this slender woman interviewing this big old guy, but she really brought something different. And she wasn't the only one. They had Jewish journalists, they had women journalists. I don't know of any African-American journalists, but this was the first time, I can think of in labor journalism where you start to really have such a shift. Here she did an illustration for the front cover of Fore and Aft about D-Day. And it's an artistic representation of D-Day, which you don't often see, but this is part of her entree into what she was doing. A lot of these illustrations were the little tiny illustrations like you see in the New Yorker, little filler illustrations, but just beautiful stuff. She did a lot of lino cuts, illustrations, sort of showing, Black-white solidarity and women in the workforce, things that you would not normally expect to see in a shipyard newspaper. Militant women, angry women, women with big wrenches. I love this woman, this one on the right, where here she is, the double shift. She's just come home from the shipyards. She's still wearing her hard hat. The image of the hard hat is mimicking the pot top, and she's waiting. Her kids are waiting for her to feed her. Well, this double shift. Women had an extra role, and this is really, really illustrated in these small graphics that were in the newspaper. Here you have, class consciousness. You've got public transportation. You've got this, businessman going off, and he's sort of going, oh my God, I'm surrounded by all these stinky workers in their greasy coveralls. But this injected a class consciousness and humor into the shipyard newspaper. The illustration on the right shows the diversity of the workforce. And these are beautiful illustrations. And this is a slice of her artistic output that was never really recognized. But because you analyze the shipyard newspapers, this adds a whole new dimension to the kind of work she did. You look at this illustration, you start to see it's a lot, the huaraches and the sombrero. This is clearly a Latin American, probably a Mexican farm worker. The whole, I talk about the labor workforce shifting. Now, we started a whole program of bringing Mexican workers to the United States. The Bracero program was started during World War II because we had a shortage of agricultural workers. I mean, the workforce was all nuts, and we had people coming in that had never really quite been here before under a federal program. So this graphic in the shipyard newspaper shows this range of workers, industrial workers. So this shows how the illustrations represented a new political reality. The only people that were not in the shipyards were Japanese Americans because they were interned. This was sort of one of the dark sides of what was going on during the home front. But on the other hand, you had people entering the workforce under various programs. In many ways, this was a breakthrough. Let's talk about childcare. When you want to bring in women to the workforce, what do? Well, Eleanor Roosevelt told Henry Kaiser, well, if you want women to work, you've got to provide childcare. He goes, okay, let's do that. So they set up the state-of-the-art childcare centers. This wasn't just, okay, let's just let's just turn over one of our warehouses into a place to put kids. He hired PhDs from UC Berkeley. They were highly paid staff. They had whole programs to teach art. Women could pick up a meal at the end of their shift when they picked up their kids for 50 cents. They really tried to make the childcare as productive as possible. This is currently where, now that it's the Maritime Center. This is a drawing of the building as it was built in the 40s. Here they talk about 8-hour orphans, but all the programs that they had for these kids. And this is really crucial to make sure that the women felt comfortable working on the job, because they needed to make sure that their kids were taken care of. Now, this was not a slam dunk. There was a lot of popular resistance to the idea of industry taking care of my kid. So it took a lot of salesmanship to say, wait a second, we're going to try to do this right. This isn't just something where you have to worry about it. We want you to be comfortable with you leaving your kids in our hands. And this was not an easy thing to do, but this was crucial to having women in the workforce. And so, but it wasn't perfect. Like I said, a lot of the labor stuff wasn't perfect. A lot of the childcare stuff wasn't perfect. And in retrospect, the woman who ran the Portland area said, we tried, but we failed at making sure to reach, mothers of color. And so they had admitted this stuff. They were very clear about the fact that, this was a new program. We tried our best, but even trying didn't work. So the whole lesson of, if you don't include people who you're trying to reach at the very planning stages, you're not gonna succeed. And this is a deep lesson about diversity and inclusion, is you can't succeed unless you have people in from the very, very beginning. So I'm gonna stop at that because I've covered a lot of ground. One thing I didn't talk about that I just remembered, the labor force is disabled people. There were people who were too disabled to go into the military and who got injured in the military and came back disabled. There was a home for them in the shipyards. This was the beginning of the modern disability rights movement. There were lots of jobs in the shipyards for people who were disabled. And at the end of the war, there's a whole conference about, okay, what's going to happen to jobs after the war for all these disabled people. But Henry Kaiser was thrilled to have a place to be able to put people in the industries. Now, this fellow on the right is my maternal uncle, Robert, who was a UC Berkeley professor of anthropology, who was a steamfitter for 4 years in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. And he also wrote for the Fore and Aft. So I'm a second generation Kaiser communicator. So hats off to you, Uncle Bob. So this is, I have down at the bottom, the website that's a new version of the website that I used to generate of Kaiser history. You can poke around in there. The top site is my own website where there's more material on this stuff. So I am going to stop sharing and go back to the program here, and thank you all.
Thank you, Lincoln. That's terrific, and definitely a whirlwind tour of the shipyards in Richmond. I really love seeing all the art. That's really interesting to me. I think we have a number of questions and would love to just have some exchange back and forth with you. To start off with, Rick was asking back when you had the picture of all of the workers in front of the rail car, or one of the pictures of the workers.
Yeah.
Did you cut a picture of yourself in the back of one of those photographs?
Oh, I inserted myself into the Henry Kaiser picture. Yes.
we thought someone looked familiar and a little modern.
Good eye.
That was Good Eye by Rick. So we had a question from Neil Cassidy, and he was asking about Black welders because Sarah has an image behind her. And he said that Betty Reed Soskin had talked about Black women being restricted from serving as welders. And what can you tell us about that?
Well, like I said, the unions were really strict about limiting the role of first women and African Americans. They ended up having less control over women coming into the workforce because of the federal law, but there wasn't a federal law requiring African Americans coming into the workforce. And so the Boilermakers especially, which was the dominant union in the shipyards, really had controls over this. And like Betty Reed Soskin, her job was working as a secretary for the Boilermakers Union, signing people up. She didn't see ships being built. And so the union was really, the way that the auxiliaries worked, and I've got a whole bunch of articles about that. African Americans paid dues, but they didn't have the same voting rights. They didn't have access to the same jobs. It was a second-class role. And so for many African Americans coming into the workforce, these were the crappier jobs. So it's true that this was just an entry to it, and they were, the whole, rainbow coalition of the workforce being all, happy African Americans and people of color and women. As time changed, it got better and better, but it was never very thorough and deep. And so it's nice to show that in part of our messaging about, we're more democratic than the fascists because we're inclusive. There were limits to that, especially because of the internment camps. And when you really pick at the employment, it was not that diverse, but it was the beginning. And it wasn't until the end of the war that they were able to successfully challenge the Boilermakers Union at the Bechtel shipyards across the bay in Sausalito and say, you can't do this. And so discrimination in hiring was a late benefit of the war. But I have to say that Henry Kaiser himself, as much as he could, made it as possible to include as many people of color and women in the workforce.
Great, thank you. Polly was just writing in the chat that the Boston Globe published photos of 2 women welders, one Black and one white. So apparently there were some, but it will be interesting to investigate more. And then since you're speaking about auxiliary employees, Terry was asking, how did auxiliary differ other than race? Or is that where they lumped all the women and Black workers together?
The women, there was the African Americans had their own auxiliary.
Okay.
And it's really fascinating labor history when you read the conventions and the Boilermakers talking about should we or should we not, allow African Americans to join. And it's the arguments were all about protecting the union. What's best for our current workers, and it's it's a common theme in all labor.
So that existing white male workers,
the auxiliaries pre-existed World War II. But it was a matter of how they interpreted them. Women were allowed to get in, but it took them fighting too. The women had to fight the Boilermakers. They had to picket the Boilermakers Union to let them in. So there's a lot of good history there.
That's interesting. What you said a little, but what do you know about the wages? So if a man left to join the military and that job was filled, do you have an idea of what he was paid and what a woman or Black labor would have earned in his place?
Well, like I said, most of the entry-level jobs were, as you can imagine, in most of the trades and journey level, they're paid less, but there was a really pretty clear policy, certainly regarding women, around equal pay for equal work. And so it was harder for them to discriminate about that. Also, the fact is, there was a fair amount of money flowing. You know, these were jobs these were federal jobs, and Henry Kaiser had a fair amount of money to, you know, he had these contracts that allowed for relatively generous pay. They weren't trying to skimp on it, and they were really careful to make sure that people who came in stayed in. They didn't want people jumping jobs. So, you know, there's an investment in training on someone. So you want somebody to come in and stick with the job. So the wages were pretty reasonable, but there's a whole other analysis that's worth going into about how the pay affected different job classifications, different races. But in general, for most people, they were making more money than they'd made before. And people were sending money home to their families in, you know, Louisiana. This was, generally speaking, these were good paying jobs.
Yeah, thank you, Lincoln. Our board member Kathy Durfee asked how many Black women worked at Richmond. Do we have any idea?
We don't really have a lot of details on that. I mean, there's not a lot of data on this, which is a whole other, I mean, there's a huge amount of scholarship that needs to be done on much of this. I mean, people ask me about employment records and stuff, and you don't have that kind of material. So there's anecdotal information, but this is a whole area where we have some clues. We don't have any hard data.
Okay.
Even the unions were not, you know, very good about. We know about Black men in the auxiliaries. The women is a weaker link.
Okay, thanks. Valerie was asking if you could talk about the Black workers' living conditions in North Richmond.
Yeah, again, the thing that's really interesting to look at this from a lens of a corporate communicator at Kaiser Permanente is, from Henry Kaiser's point of view, his job was building ships. And whatever it took to build ships was what he had to do. Well, it turns out that in this case, you know, he not only had to hire people, which involved hiring all sorts of people that normally weren't part of the workforce, he had to help provide transportation to the shipyard. So he had to bring in, you know, rail cars from New York to augment the rail system in Richmond. He also had to make sure that there was enough housing. There was a huge housing crisis during the war. And so he wasn't responsible for housing the workers, but he did help to build the housing that was run by the housing agencies in Richmond for the workers. And some of that housing was segregated. That was out of his control, but they built these housing projects, these men's dormitories. And these were quick, you know, again, you know, during the war, a lot of environmental concerns, zoning restrictions, a lot of this stuff went out the window. They were desperate to do things quickly. And so, you know, you look in retrospect, you go, well, how come they didn't enforce this code? But they were desperate to build housing. So there was a dormitory fire in which several African-American men were burned to death, which is a real tragedy. And there's a whole story about that. But again, this was part of the massive housing that had to be built to house the workers that was necessary. Situation was way worse in the Portland area, where there's a whole city that was essentially built to segregate the workers, that they didn't want them in Portland area. So, and then after the war, there was a huge flood that wiped out the entire city of Vanport. So there's a whole story there about how discrimination in housing resulted in loss of life simply because of discriminatory housing policies.
It sounds like we'll have to have you back again in our series to hear about more detail about some of these issues. Rick was asking about Kaiser's attitude toward women workers after the war ended. So you're talking about hiring Blacks and women out of necessity. It's not necessarily that he was being maybe a lead, you know, well, he was a leader in this hiring, but not because it was good or right or progressive, but just it was necessary. So when it was no longer necessary after the war, what was his attitude and what were the results? That's
a great question. Henry Kaiser himself is on record as saying, in speeches and so forth, that, you know, once women enter the workforce, this shouldn't be seen as an aberration. This should be seen as the natural flow. He was a remarkably, you know, democratic guy. He really believed in industry for sort of the people. And so you look at what happened with Henry Kaiser after World War II, when no longer needed ships for the war. At first, there was a notion that, well, we can keep the shipyards open to build ships. Well, there's no need for ships. There was a glut of ships. We were literally dumping ships overseas, sending them off to Norway to rebuild their merchant marine fleet. So then the next thing is, well, can we use the shipyards for maybe building aircraft? Because he loved aircraft, and he even partnered with Howard Hughes on the Spruce Goose. I mean, he's a fan about civilian aircraft, and there was an idea of maybe using the Kaiser Richmond shipyards for aircraft building, and there some of the facilities at Richmond continued after the war into the 50s and even into the 60s for various aerospace industries. And he was hoping that there would be some room for them, but those were on a much smaller scale. But what he did do in terms of going into other industries was he took on the auto industry. He felt there was a real need for affordable cars after the war, because during the war they didn't make any civilian cars. And so he started his own Kaiser Fraser Auto Company, set up a plant in Willow Run, Michigan. Now, you may have heard Willow Run because when we have the Rosies contest, the Rosie Run riveters, welders, that was Willow Run was actually a Ford assembly plant during the war. So Willow Run, after the war, became Kaiser Auto Industry. He was hoping that there would be some women in that. There weren't that many. So Henry Kaiser himself was unable to make sure that a lot of women were able to continue in the industries, but it wasn't for lack of trying. But it was but a lot of these women, some of them did get jobs in industry. I mean, and they're really proud of it. I mean, some of the women for the first time. Now, again, I need to point out that the first women welders were not in World War II, they were in World War I. I have a whole story about that. But there were women that continued in the trades and felt, I like this, I want to keep doing this. I like the trades. And this is really the beginning of a lot of the women in the industrial trades movement.
That's great, thank you. Earlier on in the chat, someone was asking about other sources of historical photos and artifacts, and we're asking about the Richmond Museum Board, and Karen was saying, yes, there are hundreds of historic photos and artifacts from the Richmond shipyards in their collection. So visible there. Lincoln, the items that you have access to or that you had worked with, are those available for public viewing?
The stuff that most of the stuff that I did through my job as Kaiser Permanente is somewhat accessible through reaching. There's a Kaiser Permanente historian now who will respond to public requests and be able to answer them on a case-by-case basis. The Richmond Museum of History and Culture is a great source. And in fact, the shipyard newspapers, hang on. I worked with them to digitize their collection of the newspapers. I did a similar thing in Portland for the Oregon Historical Society. So I've worked closely with them. The shipyard newspapers are all digitized and accessible through those respective institutions.
Great, thanks. It'd be great to be able to investigate an opportunity for a public showing sometime. So we'll follow up with you to see how we might do that. We have time for just a couple more questions. Donata was asking, have we ever tried to locate the children of the shipyards to record their stories? Have you recorded shipyard workers and families for a living history as a legacy resource? Do you know of anything like that?
I haven't. That's a little bit outside of my scope, but there are some in the Bancroft Library.
UC Berkeley.
And there are other projects. And it's really, again, the clock is ticking. I mean, as we know, Rosies don't last forever. And so not only the Rosies, but there were all sorts of people who worked in the shipyards. I gave a presentation a couple of days ago and the guy says, oh yeah, I was a teenager working in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. These people do exist. I mean, the Bay Area, it's hard to throw a rock and hit somebody who didn't have a relative who worked in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. They employed 90,000 people in the Bay Area. Wow. I mean, that was a lot of folks. All the shipyards and steel mill, and Henry Kaiser during the war employed 190,000 people. So there are a lot of stories out there. And they're really worth capturing. And I really encourage people to talk to your own family people, ask your relatives, capture these stories. It's really, really important stuff.
Thank you. And Sarah might be able to speak to something about the families that were there. I know when we had a recent event at the Maritime Event Center and we went in and visited the childcare center, a man who was with us that day saw his picture on the wall. So he was part of living history and didn't know it. Sarah, do you want to tell a little about that?
Sure. Well, I think that's what's really one cool thing I want to tell everyone is that back in March, the Rosie the Riveter Trust, the organization, we moved into the Maritime Child Development Center. So that illustration, the picture of the building that Lincoln showed, that is presently, we have our offices on the second floor. And if anyone is interested in coming by, we don't do tours. It's not open. It's actually Richmond College Prep, the school, the charter school is down on the first floor, but I'd be happy to, set up tours. And we're also looking to do that with the National Park Service, because in that building is an exhibit of what the classroom looked like. And we have, as Lincoln was saying, this was very carefully curated through, early childhood development professors from Berkeley. So everything and it's a really wonderful study for anybody that's interested or has a background in teaching young children. So yeah, we had an event, and not only did one of the teachers show up, the first teachers that worked at the Maritime, but so did two of the students, and they saw their pictures on the wall. So just fascinating. And I just, Lincoln, there's so much that you bring up. There's so much that we could talk about, but what a wealth of information you present. And I certainly have learned a lot. And I think that, if there's time and just maybe something closing, a question, or just would be interested in your response, Lincoln, is, how good a job are we doing preserving the story of the home front? Where do you think that we can go from here? And we certainly, I am certainly so impressed with Henry J. Kaiser. And I don't think people know his legacy. I think it's a very small circle of people that know his legacy. And especially for California, where we sit, and we do have Kaiser Permanente in terms of the healthcare system. We don't want this information. We don't want the history of what he brought and the social innovation and changes that took place under his leadership to go to not be recorded. So I just want to put that question to you of what could we do better?
Well, the park is huge. The establishment of the park and the visitor center. Kaiser Permanente was an early supporter of this, not just financially, but in terms of trying to make sure that the messaging gets across. And it's the home front. I didn't know much about the home front until I started doing this job 10 years ago. And it's a truly remarkable period of US history that most people are unaware of. There's huge research opportunities, but the visitor center is really huge. The national park has an archive of material that keeps getting added to. This is something where it's, as people clear out their closets. A few years ago, a photographer and said, "Hey, I've got a bunch of photos that my dad took in the Kaiser Richmond shipyards. Do you want them?" And I helped the archives at the park to process them. There's new material that keeps coming in all the time, and oral histories. We keep learning more stuff. That's the thing that I find fascinating about history, is in some ways we know more about things now than we did then, because we can connect the dots in a way that we didn't have the tools to do before. And when you're in the middle of something, you don't think about what's going to happen 75 years from then. You want to do it tomorrow. So, people in the moment are so wrapped up that they don't think about history. Our job now is to connect those dots and to encourage citizen scholars. Everybody out there probably has some connection to the home front. my wife's mother was a WASP. She flew planes during the war. I mean,
Wow.
everybody's got some connection. And so really mine that and try to share it and run it up the food chain, add stuff to the Rosie the Riveter Museum. I mean, this visitor center is crucial, and and Betty Reese Soskin's role in elevating the discussion of race and women within that history has transformed the National Park Service itself.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't tell stories the same way that we did 20 years ago. And it's through people like Betty, through people like the park, through Tom Leatherman, who just departed as director of the park. There's a bunch of smart, cool, committed people who are saying, let's push this, and that's being very, very successful. So thank you for letting me share some of this stuff.
Well, we count you as part of that group of cool people, and certainly advocates for this amazing history. And I really appreciate you just calling out the fact that the national park that we have, and that tells the Homefront story, that tells the story of all the people that came and worked, and this is a national story. This is not just Richmond is chosen, but this is a national story. And our park has so many resources. And I also just want to comment that person that's online today, Mike Vander Porten, we have, thanks to his family, his parents collected Homefront memorabilia. It's the largest collection, and that's part of the park. So you're right, everyone, we can mine this stuff, and we keep mining it and putting together and making connections, especially verbally. So I just found this incredibly inspirational, and thank you so much, Lincoln. I'll pass this back to Michelle to close us out for this first Rosie Presents.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Lincoln. What a tremendous day. Really look forward to doing more investigating and learning. I just wanted to mention that a number of good resources were listed in the chat. Those that Lincoln mentioned, also the Bancroft Library and Richmond's resources. We'll pull those together, and when we can send an email back to everyone who registered and provide those to you in case you'd like to do some more investigating yourself. Lincoln, we look forward to having you back again. You have clearly a lot more stories to tell, but thank you so much for getting us started today, and thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you will join us next time. Rosie Presents.
Okay, let's keep fighting fascism. We're never done.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.